You're listening to Catalyst for Change, and my name is Jessica Huckabee, your host. I started this podcast to learn what makes people resilient after challenging events and how they've used those series of events as a catalyst for change in their life. You'll hear stories of resiliency and strength, so get ready, sit back, and be prepared to be inspired. Today, my guest is Janis Isaman. She immigrated from Canada to the United States to work in the New York fashion industry. And I really wanted to understand her immigration story and how that differs from other people that we've had on the show. So Janis is now currently living in Canada, and she's the founder of My Body Couture, and she helps people feel better in their bodies. And like most business owners today, she sees clients online and in person, and her specialty is helping people rid themselves of pain. Hi, Janis. Thanks for coming on my show, Catalyst for Change, Stories of Resiliency. Can you tell me a little bit more about your story and what's made you resilient?
As I'm talking to you today, I am a lone parent business owner. My child is 10 years old and I live in Canada. That sounds like a really basic story, but the background of how that all came to be is the story of my resilience.
Oh, wonderful. So tell me more about that story. So you are a business owner, you live in Canada now, but from what I've known of you from your past, you did try at one point to immigrate to the United States. Can you tell me a little bit more about that process?
Absolutely. So, in my former life, my pre-child, pre-business owning life, I was a fashion media executive. And my first experience with immigration was moving to the United States. So, I had never actually immigrated anywhere before. I'm Canadian. Canada's a great country to live in. But in my job, the only way really to advance and to get a sort of promotion was to move to New York City. So I really was keen on doing that. I had my eye on doing that. And the process in those days, it has changed. So some of the information that I have in my experience wouldn't match what somebody would go through today. But we used to have something called the North American Free Trade Agreement. And under the NAFTA agreement, there were special work visas available for Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans. So we basically were able to exchange employees between the three countries. That sounds like something that might be easy to acquire, and it definitely was not. So there were specific lists of jobs that were required. And then the applicant had to convince an employer to apply for this visa. In some cases, I paid for that process. In other cases, the employer did. But in all scenarios, when we're looking for a job, we have to actually sit in front of an employer and say, I need you to sponsor my visa. And most employers, at least in the sector that I worked in, had never gone through that process. So it's a huge barrier to actually even getting a job offer because they could offer a job to somebody who doesn't need to go through that process.
Mm.
And the second part of the process, once that job offer was in place, was to present yourself at the border and apply for the visa. It couldn't be done in advance. So, and I only found that out because I tried to do it in advance. So it was very nerve wracking because I acquired a job. The employer agreed that they could sponsor this. I can't remember if I paid for it or not. It doesn't really matter. But I was in the process of literally moving my belongings and my items from Toronto to New York City and, hiring a moving truck, looking at apartments, getting rid of my lease, everything that you would do if you're moving. But
Yeah.
I didn't actually have a work visa. So I went to the border and inquired if I could apply for it in advance. And I was told no. Basically, you apply for it on entry. So that's really nerve wracking because I was making these major life changes. It's actually a significant financial investment to move across a border. And I wasn't even sure what the process was. We've all had the experience of going through an immigration procedure. So, for example, if you were to travel to Europe, you get off the airplane, you go through immigration.
Yeah.
In Canada, actually, at our borders, we have US immigration at every single border.
Hmm.
But we all know that you can get that grumpy border agent or something can happen.
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of process. So I was able to successfully acquire that work visa. And 6 weeks after I started that job, I was fired. It was a mutual scenario where I think when I was hired, it seemed like a great pathway to achieve my dream and to get to the United States. It was in the right industry. I had a great interview experience, but because there was this huge gap of time between when I got the job offer and when I actually started, someone else was actually hired to sit in the middle in between us. And we were like oil and water, just not a fit. I never would have accepted a job to work underneath this woman. I can probably guess that she wouldn't have hired me. From the moment we laid eyes on each other, it just was not a match. And
Mm,
so it was 6 very trying, very difficult weeks of work, and I actually knew way sooner than 6 weeks that this was not a good job. I remember I don't cry a whole lot, and I remember going home and crying quite frequently after work.
yeah.
But because I was fundamentally an immigrant, I didn't have a lot of choice. So, again, I'm speaking from the perspective of a Canadian.
Hmm.
To get this work visa, you have to have a university degree, you have to go on the open job market and apply and get that job offer and overcome extra hurdles with that. But then my entire future was tied to this job that I no longer wanted to have.
Wow, that is very challenging. So what happened after you were fired from that job? The things didn't work out. So what happened then?
So I put in a call to my old boss and let him know that I had just been fired. And I said to him, I know that I'm supposed to be upset right now, but I feel so much better.
Yeah,
And then I lived in a state where, legally speaking, there I had to actually exit the United States. I had to do it that day. There is
that
no
day.
extension on that. There's no compassion on that. It didn't matter that I literally had just leased an apartment, literally.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so basically, in that first 6 weeks, I didn't even get a chance to get settled because if you've ever moved long distance, you can relate to the experience that the moving company tells you it's going to be 2 weeks, and it's more like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's a lot.
Yeah. So your stuff just showed up at your
Yes.
door and you got fired or things didn't work out at that job.
Yeah.
And then that day you had to drop the lease and figure out how to get all your stuff back. But not having a lot of time to do all of that since you were supposed to be out of the country in that same day that you were
Right.
fired.
Right.
Okay. So tell
Right.
me about that process.
So that was a massive scramble because on one hand, I was super relieved to just be free of this job, but on the other hand, I had worked for, without exaggerating, a couple of years to acquire that liberty to get that work visa. So I was so torn, and then it's a huge panic because I've just invested all this money and effort to get everything to New York City. I did have a lease, etc. So actually, I did leave the country. The fortunate part in this particular part of the story is that as a Canadian, I could come back in as a tourist, and we have fairly generous tourist abilities.
Yeah.
And I use that time to, instead of moving and repacking and heading home, I use that time to hustle to get a new job. And so I got in touch with literally everybody I knew in the industry, and I found a stopgap job. So everybody always says you can't get hired right before Christmas. My first day of work was the holiday Christmas party, and which was great. So I did get a new job. It wasn't necessarily my dream job, but that was something that I actually used that window of opportunity for, was to go back into the United States and do everything in my power to renew that visa. So then I got to go through that whole process again, had to leave the country again, reapply for the work visa after convincing yet another employer to go through this process with me. So then things stabilized for quite a period of time. What I will say is that it is very nerve wracking to be in the position where your entire future and your career depends on a work visa.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in this case, the NAFTA visa was always based on temporary residence. So I had to keep ties to Canadian bank accounts, and I had to keep ties to Canada. So the
Yeah.
idea behind NAFTA, that visa was never it actually there was no path to a green card, there was no path to permanent residency. It was you're welcome to come here and work.
If you can get a job, if you can keep that job, and if you could afford to move yourself, basically.
100%. And
Yeah.
so because of that experience in those early days, I don't think that I ever spent any time at all ever relaxed about my work scenario, because I knew that my entire future depended on contracts being renewed, job offers being renewed, things
Yeah.
going well at work. And I mean, these are things that we can all just kind of shove into the back of our mind. But when that's at the forefront of where you live, the community that you're building, friendships, your financial security, it's very nerve-wracking. So I think that I was always a little bit on edge about the work visa, and every time I traveled, I would actually have anxiety about it, and that was simply because I had gone through that early
Yeah.
on in that initial immigration process.
Okay. And so through all of these, so you were in the fashion industry in New York, sounds very exciting,
It
very
was.
interesting. Started a new job at the Christmas party, basically.
Yes.
And so what I mean, and you had all these, I mean, it sounds like a very interesting life that you have. And so what kept you resilient through that period of all this anxiety going on? It sounds like you had some anxiety or
I did.
some challenges with thinking that you may have to leave the country quickly if things didn't work out at an employer. So what made you resilient? What helped you become
I think
resilient?
in that case, it was literal blind passion for what I was doing. I did get to do really, really interesting things. I ended up later switching jobs and working for IMG, who owned and produced New York Fashion Week. So I got to work for the company that was affiliated with Fashion Week in the division that was producing Fashion Week. So that
Nice.
was a really amazing, incredible opportunity. And I think it was really kind of almost external. So in the next phase of my resiliency story, it really turned internal. But I think at that phase, it was such a drive to have these experiences and to meet these people and to really soak up every moment that that opportunity afforded me, because I got to go to Fashion Week. I got to literally meet designers that whose clothes I wore. I got to attend talks and just do all these really fascinating things that were in an industry that I felt super passionate about.
Yeah. So it sounds like it was worth it to you to take the risk because it was such an interesting job and experience that you had.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think I think that's a super great way to put it, because had I not felt that that was worth the risk, I would have just packed my stuff and returned home, because it was more secure and I could be more confident that it was all going to proceed smoothly.
Okay. And so tell me what made you end up moving back to Canada?
So, the particular work visa that I was working under had to be renewed annually. And the last time I went to renew that work visa, my worst fear came true. And it was not renewed. So I was once again standing at an airport and placing the mercy of my life at an on an immigration official's desk. And that person that day decided that he would not grant my work visa.
Was there
So
a reason? Did they give you a reason for that?
they did give me reasons. It took them 2 hours to build the case of reasons. So it was not something that was obvious. It was not something that I had actually done anything wrong. The reasons that they provided were facts about this particular company's financials that I had no way to know, and
Okay.
facts about the owner of the company, who was herself on a work visa, which I had no way to know. So these were
Yeah.
really interesting to me because I was like, I wouldn't have any access to this information. So they were literally pulling tax files and immigration documents of people affiliated with this particular company who had offered me a job.
Wow.
So this wasn't something that I could have potentially even realized was going to be an issue.
So you weren't able to make an educated decision on where to work. If you would have known that, maybe you would have chose not to work at that place, maybe, or if you would have known not to. So this is something that you had no way of knowing in order to make your decision.
No, and I mean, I can look back on that and say, well, I should have looked into that, or I could have predicted that. But all of these work visa applications, and I think I made 6 of them in total,
Yeah.
were done with the hands and expense and guidance of a law firm. So these aren't documents that I was doing up on my home computer.
Yeah. So the lawyers knew what was going on. They probably had access to that, and they had the best interest of you and the
Absolutely.
company in mind. Yeah.
Right. And so I paid for that application myself. That one I do remember. And then obviously my first call was to the lawyer, and the advice that they gave me that day, again, I have the good fortune of being Canadian. We
Mhm.
can actually enter the United States quite liberally. And he said, you haven't done anything wrong, but I would definitely advise that you probably don't make an effort to re enter the United States until you have documents and evidence showing that you live and work in Canada. Well, I had just spent some years in the United States. I didn't live and work in Canada. I had no lease. I had no cell phone bill. I had no tie in that way where I had documents and evidence to show that I was living and working in Canada, because factually I wasn't, and I hadn't for a good number of years.
Yeah.
So that was the moment that I would really say that my life was spun upside down, because the first time I was actually living in the United States, the second time I was not. And that made all the difference, actually, because I was actually on the north side of the border when that application was denied.
Okay.
So I didn't lose it. I just simply didn't renew it, but I was actually standing in Canada. So, with no ability, particularly at that moment, to start the job reapplication process, I knew that this one was different because I wasn't physically present in New York City to just go up the street to go on a job interview.
Yeah.
And I didn't really explain in the middle part of that story, but these job interviews, I mean, it was painful on a certain level, because it's not like I would just apply for 2 jobs and get one of them. The process of having to convince an employer to apply for one meant that I had to go on endless job interviews to get an offer. So it was different because I couldn't just put in some calls and go to 25 job interviews knowing that I could probably get one, when I had to fly in and out and I had no documentation to actually even
Wow.
properly enter the country.
Yeah.
So it was a moment of dramatic, rapid, oh, that chapter in my life is over.
Yeah. So what made you finally decide to just say, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to see what I can do about starting my life over in Canada.
It was that moment. I remember that on the drive home, a realization that everything had actually just changed. So my physical belongings were south of the border. My lawyer told me, make sure you have documents that show you live and work in Canada. And, by the time you have documents that show that you live and work in Canada, guess what? You live and work in Canada.
Yeah.
So I actually knew that that's where that was going. I talked to the lawyer and we figured out some other pathways that this could happen, but it certainly was not a straightforward process. And at the end of it, I ended up pulling out of any sort of backup plan, because it's almost impossible to simultaneously develop 2 pathways in life, one where I'm trying to get back there and one where I'm trying to establish myself here. That just wasn't something that was that was
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah. No, that sounds very difficult. So you're living two double, like a
Yeah.
double life, is for instance.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So tell me what you're doing now in Canada.
Yeah. So I had a personal passion that I threw all of my time and energy and money into when I wasn't working in the media. And that was a health and fitness passion. So many, many, many years ago, I injured my knee and I really struggled to find solutions. And that event turned into 15 years of taking fitness trainings and taking nutrition trainings and going to conferences and acquiring bookshelves worth of books and reading and absorbing and learning everything I could about the human body, meeting collections of people. And I had no idea that in the background of my life, I was doing basic preparation for a completely separate career. So, but that's exactly what I accidentally was doing. So, what went through my head after I called a family member to come pick me up from the airport after the unsuccessful work visa application was, huh, I've never ever had time to work at a yoga studio. And I really have no idea why that popped into my mind, except that I knew I wasn't going back to work. I wasn't in New York City anymore. And I looked for things that I felt like I just had never had the opportunity to do. So, yoga studios commonly offer something they call energy exchange, where you volunteer for the studio, sweeping the floor, checking people in, doing some laundry, things like that,
Yeah.
in exchange for the classes, in exchange for a membership. So that was actually the first thing that I did. And when I look back on that, I remember literally sitting in the vehicle having that thought, and it was so calm and so clear. And so even though this chaos actually was kind of unfolding behind me, where my life had just literally burned down, I
Mm.
was in this car kind of driving out of it with this super calm, clear thought of, what can I do that I've just never had the time to do? And I moved straight into this fitness and hobby passion, which I had already been a certified teacher for 6 years, I think, at that point. So it wasn't something that was even brand new. It wasn't something I needed to go acquire. So that was the first thing that I actually did. And I met a community of people. I'd never actually done yoga per se before, so that was something that was brand new to me. And I think in retrospect, that is what really helped me
Yeah.
pass the idea that I was going to have a new life. And it wasn't one that I necessarily chose to have, but that I could actually enjoy doing new things. And I could just embrace the idea that there were experiences that I wasn't able to have when I was doing this really high paced New York City fashion job. There wasn't
Yeah.
time to be volunteering at a yoga studio. Let me assure you of that.
Yeah. It sounds like that job really would bring you back to your center and help you figure out the rest of your life. I mean, because it really helps you center. That's what I would
Yeah.
assume.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what I did was volunteered at the yoga studio and then start the process of what probably wasn't, but feels to me in my memory like doing a solid year of paperwork to reestablish my Canadianness. And, it was opening bank accounts and getting a healthcare card and working out the logistics of my driver's license and just endless, endless, endless reams and reams and reams of paper to put myself back in a different country. What was also really fascinating for me was that I was born and raised in Canada. I moved within Canada, so I didn't always live in the same place. So where I currently live, I hadn't lived in this region of the country since I was 20, 21, something like that.
Yeah.
So for in my mind, I was coming home, but I actually had a big gap in there. I had a 15-year adulthood gap. So I actually had reverse culture shock where I didn't understand how the social system worked. I didn't understand how people built community. I didn't understand anything about being an adult in
Yeah.
this particular culture.
And how long were you in New York for? I'm sorry if you mentioned that or I didn't ask it.
It was from 2007 to 2011. So,
Okay. So
yeah,
10 to 11, or I'm sorry, you say that again. I'm sorry.
it was from 2007 to 2011.
Okay. Okay. So, and then you just hadn't been back to where you ended up moving when you came back to
Yeah,
Canada. You hadn't been there in
basically,
15 years.
correct. So basically, I grew up in this general region of the country. I don't live currently where I grew up. And then
Yeah.
when I finished my post-secondary education, I moved to Toronto and I spent some time in San Francisco and I lived in Montreal. And that's the opposite side of the country from where I live at the moment.
Yeah.
So for 15 years, I had actually been removed from the general region of where we grew up. And if you're in America, it's kind of like moving from Texas to California or from, California to New York or moving to the Midwest. There's different regional variances in how people orient themselves and how their social structures are set up and how easy it is to make friends and the different kind of occupations and gender roles and you name it,
Very
all of
different. Yeah.
me was in my head. I was coming home, but the reality was I had never lived here as an adult, and I was like, I don't have a clue what's what's happening.
Yeah. So how did you end up fitting back into Canadian society?
I don't know if I ever did. um, so because I found myself in that position where literally I changed countries, I changed cities, I changed jobs and careers, and all of that happened within such a short window. It wasn't until years later that I actually really processed that social piece of it because I mean, when I first came back, I actually legally had no documentation. I must have maintained a Canadian passport, but there was just a lot of things I didn't even own. We have nationalized healthcare here, and I didn't have paperwork to go to the doctor. So I was really distracted by I need to find a way to make a living and I need to get myself on the ground in a way that I can function with a driver's license and go to the doctor and get
Yeah.
an apartment because I don't even know what's going on with my credit history because there's a huge gap there, etc. So, I mean, that's a great question. I think that when I put myself back into that space, I can't even answer it because it was so far removed from I just know that I struggled in that area, but I didn't even have time or energy to put into it.
Yeah. It just happened over a period of time.
Yeah.
And now you feel like a Canadian again.
Yes. I'm very pro Canadian healthcare. Let me tell you that. So that
I
makes me very
bet.
Canadian.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, I heard that they have very good benefits of citizenship in Canada
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yeah, it's a wonderful place to live. Now, is it as difficult? Do you know if it's as difficult for Americans when they move to Canada as it is for probably not as difficult as it was for you moving to the United States?
Well, one part of the story that I neglected to mention was when I was living in the United States, I had a baby. And
Okay.
he is actually an American citizen, and he's an American citizen by birth. So in all of that story, it's I don't know why I didn't mention that because that's not that's not an insignificant detail.
Yeah,
So
that's a huge thing. That's a lot of work
yeah, it's a huge thing,
on top of everything else you were going through at the same time.
right?
Yeah.
So in that piece of the story, I was also still acclimating to the newness of being a mother. So he was a year old, I believe,
Yeah.
and standing at the border just for myself when my life's been upended is very different than standing at the border when now that's two people that are impacted.
Yeah.
So Canadians actually are very generous with our citizenship programs in terms of any Canadian who has a Canadian, in terms of anybody who is born to a Canadian citizen
Hmm.
becomes a citizen automatically. So I'm speaking from the perspective of this is easier already than it would be for somebody who wasn't in that position.
Yeah.
But I actually really struggled the first time he came back with me across the border, I got pulled into secondary inspection and asked where his documentation was. And I was told that he had no right to enter the country. And so I don't think that it actually is easier. So we assume as Canadians and Americans that I've seen a lot of narratives and I've seen a lot of narratives in the last 4 years about I want to move to Canada because
Yeah.
of the political situation. It really is not easy. And I think Canadians often believe that we can just freely move to the United States. And I had that experience both with myself and with my American citizen son coming north of the border. It is not an easy process. And that's probably as easy as it gets for anybody because we have that neighborly openness. We have extra work visas. We've got generous travel visas, etc.
Yeah.
So if I had that experience, I can extrapolate that it's much more difficult for somebody who didn't have that benefit.
Yeah.
Also had it was a very special time when I mentioned all the paperwork that I needed to fill out. He had no ties to Canada, so we had to go through the entire process from scratch, and that created reams and reams and reams and reams
But
and
even though you were a Canadian citizen, he didn't
yes.
have ties to Canada.
Correct. That's what it was. That's what it was deemed to be. So,
Wow.
although technically he was automatically Canadian by birth, there needs to be documentation to show that.
Yeah.
And I actually applied for his Canadian citizenship when we were both in the US, but it took a full 18 months. And that's, again, an application from a Canadian citizen parent. It was
Wow.
a pretty clean application. So when we arrived at the border, I didn't have a piece of paper that said, yes, he's a citizen. He didn't get that until later. And then it was really hard to get him a tax number. It was hard to open a bank account. It was hard to get a health number. It was hard to actually do anything.
Yeah.
And we're talking again about, a minor who's such a minor, he could walk at that age, but
He couldn't
not
have chose to come across any borders.
correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. He wasn't independent in any measure. I remember that time when we were apprehended and pulled into secondary, and he was breastfeeding. Like there was no capacity for him to be making that choice. He would have died without me, literally. So I was like, oh, this is a very interesting kind of interrogation at midnight with a child who not only can't walk, but literally can't feed himself.
I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate, but were they worried because babies are stolen from the United States and brought into Canada, or are they worried that like
Oh, that's a good
maybe,
question.
yeah, and I'm just wondering why there's suspicion around a breastfeeding infant coming across the border. No, I'm just serious. I
No,
mean,
that's
maybe there's some precedent, something happened
that's a great
after.
question. So
Yeah,
Canada actually has some of the most stringent rules in the entire world about child smuggling, if you will. So
yeah,
we generally need letters from the other parents, and we need documentation that shows that we're authorized to travel. I
yeah,
actually had all that stuff. So that's why that was a great question, because that is a very pertinent concern of the Canadian government, but that wasn't the issue that particular day. It was this person is not a citizen,
yeah,
and this person is a person. They don't have paperwork. And so it actually isn't easier for Americans to come into Canada in that level than it is for probably anybody from any other country. He wanted legal documentation and legal verification that this individual was actually legally entitled to enter the country.
yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
So you finally made it back, and he's 10 years old now and thriving, and you guys are
yeah.
both fitting into Canadian
Yes,
society,
yeah,
and it sounds like you're running your own business.
yeah, I am.
And tell me more about that.
Well, I opened a business, and I mean, it's it's some sort of like suicide mission to open a business at the same time as single parenting a child, but I have done that and I have co-raised the business and my child. So I took that hobby that I was really passionate about and turned it into a bricks and mortars business where I service customers and I help them feel better in their bodies. So that's kind of an amorphous way to put it. But basically, when people feel that their neck hurts or when their back hurts or when their shoulders hurt, I've seen it all: knees, shoulders, feet, all of it.
Yeah.
And quite often they've been to other practitioners, so been to the massage therapist and the chiropractor and the acupuncturist. They will get temporary relief from any of those modalities. Those are great modalities.
Yeah.
I actually refer patients back and forth to those practitioners. But then they go back and sit at their desk. Then they go back and live with their spouse. Then they go back and have the stress of raising children or what have you. And that pain comes back. So I have a very, very holistic practice where I work with movement modalities to build body awareness, to build emotional skill sets, to build exercise based habits and practices, to really focus on what I call body sustainability, which means that we need our bodies to function and we ideally want them to function in a pain-free way. So I meet people kind of where they're at. Some people are ready to jump into some emotional stuff. Some people have never been aware of their body in any capacity. I work privately with people so that we can really be where they are. But I work with wherever they are to kind of pull them to a place where their body is not in pain. Pain is a huge distraction, takes a lot of energy, and it drains us of our capacity to live a fully expressed life and follow our dreams and our passions. So I always ask people what their goals are. I've gotten all kinds of things from I want to be able to work in the garden to, you know, I worked with a 5-time Olympic medalist. So it's quite a
Wow.
range.
Well,
Every
walk me through one of your sessions that you have,
so
or
when
like a
people
standards. I mean, if there is
yeah,
such thing as a standard session.
I think initially they are a bit standard because we need to get acquainted with my techniques and with that person's body. So their body meets my techniques. And so my foundational movements are the things that people do all the time, every day: walking and sitting and standing. So I'll have somebody do a few basic movements. Maybe they'll rotate, maybe they'll sit in a chair, maybe they'll walk across the room. And I look for things in their body that maybe just aren't making sense. And there's quite a dialogue with the person who's coming to see me. So I will always ask them what they're feeling and if the things that I'm observing match what they feel. So we're building that body awareness through dialogue right away. So that's a huge piece of it. And then let's say I had somebody walk and I'm seeing that there's quite a bit of pelvic deviation as they're doing that, and I'm like, okay, I don't think their abs are really working. Then we're going to do an exercise to help turn on the abs, for lack of better phrasing. We're going
Yeah.
to help integrate that into their body. Then we go back and we do the walking to see if we actually made some progress. So it's very, I don't want to call it science based, but we're doing little mini experiments the whole session because I don't want to send that person home with, here, go do these 4 exercises if they're not effective.
Yeah.
But I think we also then are able to say, okay, this is how you moved before. Now we've done an exercise to create a little bit of freedom, open your body up. Now let's do that exercise again, and we're going to feel different sensations with that same movement. And for most people, it's like the lights have turned on in the room
Yeah.
because they've gone from a really compressed, tight state where the movements are really cut off and they don't feel a sense of freedom and joy when they move to, oh, right, I remember feeling like this when I was a kid, or I remember feeling, no one's ever said that to me, but it takes the body back home to a place that it was before it felt this pain and compression and tension.
Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like it's a hybrid of like physical therapy or something of that nature is what we call it. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually always describe myself as in the center of the Venn diagram between a physiotherapist and a personal trainer, because the people that are coming to me do have aches and pains and complaints, but they're also looking to have a more active lifestyle. It's a movement-based set of techniques and modalities. It's not, I'm not doing acupuncture where I'm sticking needles in. I'm not having somebody lay down and talk about their feelings and emotions, although that
Yeah.
does inevitably come up because that stuff is coming out of the body. But we're learning lifelong exercise skills. I'm doing a lot of educating. I use a skeleton. I'm helping people really understand their bodies in a way that we never were taught when we were in junior high. We learned
Yeah.
here's the femur bone, and no care and tending thereof. Nobody explained what sensation should feel like, or how we can make sure that both ends of the bone are moving properly, or how much space should be in there, what that feels like when we have it versus when we don't. So there's a lot of education, not a lot of sweating, but that's why it's in the center of the diagram. And again, this is applicable whether I literally had a client who hadn't worked out for 42 years. And then I had the ex-Olympian. So
Yeah.
anywhere on that spectrum of athleticism, this still does apply.
Oh, wonderful. So you went from being in the fashion industry to being in health and wellness. And that's really a big shift.
It was a
And
huge
you were able to find your center through going back to, volunteer at a yoga studio, figuring out what you really liked, figuring out what really spoke to you, following that passion, and also being resilient at the same time. It sounds like, since you had a young son that you were raising at the same time as you were dealing with immigration issues and trying to get your business off the ground
yes.
and reintegrate into the Canadian society for both you and your son. Now, do you have anything that you would want to tell somebody that is going through a difficult immigration process, wherever they may be located in the world or wherever they may be trying to get to? What would you have loved to have known?
Having gone through this entire process, I really look back on that phase of my life when I was living in the United States and how much kind of underlying fear there was in me all the time of this could happen at any moment. Anytime I cross the border, this could be taken away from me.
Yeah.
So I had this fear-based, neurology really within me. So that was, I would actually, on the way to the airport, I could feel my heart rate pick up. I could feel my breathing pick up.
Yeah, because you
It's
knew that
not,
there might be a confrontation or there might be somebody pulling you into a room saying, well, your paperwork isn't in order. You need
yeah.
to go back to where you came from.
Yeah. And
That sounds very nerve-wracking.
there was never an immigration violation. It just was a perception because of that first experience where all of
Yeah.
a sudden it was gone, and recognizing how devastating that actually was to my life. So I think if the advice that I would actually give is what I later did, and recognizing again that, by then I was kind of on the north side of the border, but really developing a personal daily practice, which means not reading it once or listening to a podcast or listening to somebody else speak about it, but literally doing a daily practice of body awareness to get me back in my body, to remember what it is to feel calm, and to then use that to make those decisions. Because I think sometimes, I really wanted to live in the United States. I would again, but if I was to actually go backwards, I'd be really curious what my body felt like, because maybe that wasn't even worth the cost of what I was enduring.
Yeah.
And so in the subsequent years, I've folded it into my practice because this is the process I had to go through for my own resilience. I mean, how did I get out of the pile of I just had a child, now I moved, I changed careers, I changed jobs, I changed social networks. I
Yeah.
there
That's
wasn't
huge.
there wasn't
Huge.
really any way to stack more change on top of that.
Mm.
And it really came down to, this didn't happen overnight, but developing practices where I literally lay on my yoga mat every day and I just have the experience of what does my body feel like? And it's not always feeling great.
Yeah.
But I started with a 14-minute practice, and these days it's an hour most days, but that has been the mission critical piece of getting through. It sounds overly simple and also overly difficult. Most people don't do it.
Yeah.
And it's because our mind is racing and we're thinking about what we have to do in our to-do list. But those minutes that I just talked about are the only time in my whole day when I'm not thinking about, well, this could happen and that could happen, and I need to do this and I need to do that. It's time when I can actually just be calm in my body, and then that can guide some of my decisions.
Yeah. So being calm in your body, checking in with your body,
Yes,
helps you build resilience and keep going through everything that you've been through. And this, it
correct.
was established through a number of years, not just overnight. So people need
Definitely.
to be aware that it doesn't just happen overnight. The idea came to you and then you started off slowly and then you made it work from there. Well, that's
Yeah,
wonderful. Yeah. So that's really
yeah.
important.
And I think it is important to share that when I first started this work, I mean, I was so panicked and agitated and jittery that it felt like separation anxiety to be away from my cell phone. And nothing was happening on my cell phone. I didn't have a job.
Yeah. But that is a big addiction for our society these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was the idea of, well, something could happen at any moment. And what if I miss that moment? And so I felt like it was almost impossible for me to calm my mind or to actually be present. So, I mean, it has been years of practice, but I do want to mention that that's where I started, because I think often when we hear about awareness or mindfulness practices, we think it's easier for other people. And I couldn't even make it through 5 minutes without having my phone within arm's reach. And I'm like, I'll just check this. And then, of course,
Yeah.
pop out of pop out of the present. So even though I was teaching this work for myself, it was not easy to practice. And as the years have gone by, my practice improves, my teaching improves, and I really relate to people who are coming from that type A jittery mindset, because that's where I came from.
Yeah. Well, great. I mean, that gives me hope that I can break through from
Yes.
that and that other
Yes.
people I know can too.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, is there anything you think we may not have covered today?
I think resiliency is often spoken about as an event, but it's a process. So it's not a single moment in time when we're able to just reach inside and pluck out the resiliency chip. And
Yeah.
resiliency is something that is not an idea, but a practice. And we also have to, just like any practice, we can't just do it once. And like any practice, we have to actually practice if we want to be able to access it. And part of that practice is knowing when we've actually reached our limit. So we love stories of people that have been pushed to the limit and developed that resiliency. But it's clinically known that if we actually go past it, we fall off that cliff. So that's part of why we need these practices, to stretch and to become slightly uncomfortable and to learn how to cope and manage and self-soothe, etc.
Yeah.
As there isn't this treasure chest of resiliency that we can just open, grab it, apply as needed, and then carry on with our life.
Yeah. It's not a one-time use situation.
No.
It's reusable. Yeah. It's not one-time use forks that you get. It's like the ones that you keep on using every day.
Yeah.
Your silverware in the drawer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you so much for coming on my show today. I really enjoyed speaking with you and learning more about your immigration story and what makes you resilient after, those challenging times that you've had and what keeps you resilient. And I'll make sure to put all of your information in our show notes so listeners know where to find you. And I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Catalyst for Change, and my name is Jessica Huckabee, your host. Join us next week for another story of resiliency. And please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and feel free to leave me a comment or email me at catalystforchange20@gmail.com, or on Facebook, we have a page at Catalyst for change, resiliency.